A Kitsune in Remnant, Chapter 4, Back to School. Russell, Thrush, Cardin, Winchester, Dove, Branswing, and Skylark, you four have successfully gathered the bishop pieces. From this day onward, you will be Team Cardinal. Ospen droned emotionless at the front of the auditorium to the rest of the school. To Naruto, he couldn't have sounded any more bored as he listed off the names. Led by Cardin Winchester, he finished to a smattering of applauses. The four boys walked off, no, strutted, only to be replaced by Para, Whis, Ren, and Nora. Para, Nikos, Wishning, Lyran, and Nora Valkyrie. You four successfully collected the rook pieces. Henceforth, you shall be Team Periwinkle. Spin said, causing some snickers and giggles to emanate from the watching crowd, led by Paranikos. This time a great cheer went up along with the thunderous applause towards the new team leader. While Para looked surprised at her new position, Nora and Ren were happily clapping along with their new captain. On the other hand, Weiss was politely clapping along, though she looked pretty miffed at the fact she wasn't captain, but she would defer to such a famous figure. As they walked off, Osmond called the final names Ruby Rose, Kitsune, Blake, Belladonna, and Yang Xiaolong. You four collected the knight pieces. Henceforth, you shall be known as Team Ruby. Naruto sent an irritated glare at Osmond for using his real name in the team mashup. He was ignored, led by Ruby Rose. There was a polite applause to go with the proclamation, but it couldn't drown out the harsh whispers about Naruto along with the glares. Ruby looked at Naruto with a frown, ignoring Yang's over-the-top congratulations, but it was waved off. They began walking off the stage when held up a hand at Naruto to wait. Although he gave a curious look, he stopped and stood at the center of the stage. As you or may not know, since the war peace talks are underway and are progressing at a steady pace, I have taken it upon myself to help speed these along by offering to host the shinobi from one of the 5 hidden villages. As you can see, they accepted. This here is Kitsune, and he is a Jonin from Konohagure, or Hidden Village in the Leaves, said Shinobi, bowed slightly as a greeting. As well as his place here as a student, Kitsune will be teaching the history of his home continent, and before any of you think about bunking his lessons, they count for 20% of your final grade. Groans filled the hall. Finally, he will be holding extracurricular hand-to-hand lessons for Friday after lessons are complete. Osmond finished to the angry mutterings of the crowd. Kitsu simply rolled his eyes and walked off the stage where only Ruby and Pyro were waiting for him. Ruby grinned at him and leaned forward with her hand behind her back. You didn't say you were going to be a teacher. Naruto poked her in the forehead as he passed, getting a squawk of surprise. You never asked, Gaki. What? This time was Pyro's turn to question what he said. It means brat. Naruto stage whispered to her as all three walked in the direction he knew the dorms to be, both blanking at Ruby's indignant cries. It didn't take long for them to reach the dorms, and Naruto and Ruby bid farewell to Pyra as they separated in the hallway and entered their assigned rooms using their e-scrolls to open the doors. The dorm room was fairly simple, looking more like a standard hotel room than one from a prestigious school. There were 4 beds in the room, 2 on each side of the window that sat in the center, and for each bed there were a set of drawers and a wardrobe along with a desk and a chair combination. Another door sat in the corner on the left-hand wall, presumably to an into the bathroom. Yang and Blake were already present and were sitting on the rightmost beds. Naruto eyed his pack on the bed next to the bathroom and deduced that their spots were already chosen for them. While Naruto went over to inspect his space, Ruby had bounced over to her older sister with a massive grin on her face. Yang, why weren't you there for the announcement? Ruby whined. Yang shrugged and she looked over Ember Silica on her bed. I wasn't interested in what the headmaster had to say about the shinobi. Ruby frowned. His name is Kitsune, and now he is a member of this team and my partner. Besides, he's also a teacher now, she explained. Why do you hate him anyway? Like, I get there was a war and all, but it didn't really affect us at all, she asked. Yang grimaced and looked away. You're too young to understand, Ruby. was all she said before going back to her gauntlets. Ruby, although not convinced, accepted the answer and turned to Blake when she spoke up. "What's he teaching?" she asked, not looking up from her book. "The history of my home and hand-to-hand after school on Friday as an extracurricular," Naruto answered for Ruby from across the room. Blake's eyes flicked to Naruto in slight interest before going back to her book. Naruto finished his inspection of opening the wardrobe and inspecting the uniforms provided. Of course, they were something he had never worn before. He didn't even know what the item around the collar was. Shrugging in resignation, he took off his cloak and hung it inside as well as his belt and harness. He then proceeded to detach both sheets for his Tanto and Ninjato so he could clean them. Walking back to his bed, he set the blades along with his pouches on the mattress and instead headed to the only window of the room. He opened it and hopped up to sit on the window sill side on. He fumbled with the pocket on his flak jacket for a moment before fishing out a packet of cigarettes. He picked one from the remaining half and popped it in his mouth using a small genjutsu to hide his face. He then slipped the packet back into his pocket and afterwards. You could blame Asuma for getting Naruto into the habit. He had picked it up while apprenticing under him for a few months to improve his wind nature. He never got out of it despite the urging from his friends. With a simple click, he lit a small fire on the tip of his index finger and used it to light the cigarette. The click apparently drew the attention of the room's other occupants. "Wait, you smoke?" Blake asked. Naruto shrugged. "Takes off the edge." He said simply, "Isn't that, like, bad for you?" Ruby pointed out. Naruto shrugged again. This it was accompanied by a cloud of smoke. "Most shinobi don't live to see their 30s, let alone see the effect of smoking," he explained. Ruby's eyes widened and she recoiled in mild shock. Blake, on the other hand, nodded in understanding. "You enjoy life while you can instead of when it's too late," she summarized, and Naruto just nodded in acknowledgement. Moments later, turning his attention to the now setting sun, Blake was awake by a soft scratching between pauses coming from the general direction of the window. After it persisted for a few minutes, she concluded it wasn't ending anytime soon and decided to at least see what time it was. Opening her amber eyes, she gazed at the digital clock Ruby set up before they went to sleep, which read at 6:13, just under an hour before the alarm they set off would go off. "Sorry we woke you up, Miss Belladonna," a voice said. Blake turned her head to the right slightly and viewed Kitsune sitting in the window again, this time with his back to the room and his legs dangling out the window, wearing his uniform but with the tie hung loosely around his neck. He seemed focused on whatever he was doing in his lap and took periodic glances up at the view outside before scratching at his lap again. "What are you doing?" she asked, sitting up with a stretch. "Sketching," he answered simply. "Sketching? I didn't take you to be one to sketch," Blake admitted, standing up and walking behind their team Shinobi where she was able to see the rather large notebook sitting in his lap and the view from outside the window. Naruto shrugged again. "You wouldn't have thought I smoked earlier, but—" He trailed off and just shrugged to finish off his sentence. Blake studied the drawing that was slowly taking form on the notepad and compared it to the view outside. "Wow, that's impressive for just a sketch," she praised. "How did you learn?" Naruto chuckled slightly. "Trial and error, mostly error," Naruto confessed. At the particularly dark part of my life came around, about midway through the year-long wait, the hobbies that would usually cheer me up didn't work anymore. A fellow shinobi called Sai, that I had worked with occasionally, apparently heard my plight and offered to teach me how to ask thanks for saving his life once on a mission. And, Blake pressed. Naruto stopped sketching for a moment. It helped. It was only a bonus that I could do it while away on a mission. My other hobbies included botany and training, neither of which is fit for a mission, he finished explaining. He put the pencil down fully this time with a melancholy look in his eyes. "If you think this is good, the pictures he could paint in a short time would make mine look like a 4-year-old scribble," he said with thought in his eyes. "Where is he now?" Naruto's eyes narrowed and darkened for not even a moment, but it was still enough for Blake's fondest eyes to catch before they shifted back to their bored manner. "Dead by your people's hands," was all he said, but the tone he said it in basically ended the conversation on its own. Blake stepped back at the slight hostile tone and decided she may as well get ready now that she was up. The two sisters woke up later at the alarm at 7. and were ready at the 7:30 to join their new partners. Ruby raised an arm in the air with way more energy than that was appreciated for the time. "Good morning, Team Ruby," she yelled with excitement. "Now that we're all awake and dressed, we can begin the first order of business." Naruto raised an eyebrow from his position on the window. "And what would that be, Captain?" he asked, correcting himself from slipping back into Ninshu. "Decorating," Yang cried with a grin. "To match your sisters," her arm clammed to the brim with stuff. Blake nodded along. "We do need to unpack," she agreed. The suitcase she held blew open, causing all her stuff to fall out. "And clean up," she finished. "All right, Kitsune, Yang, Blake, and their fearless leader Ruby have begun the first mission. Banzai!" she cried, throwing her fist into the air again, this time with Yang and Blake reciprocating the movement. "Banzai!" Naruto merely smiled in amusement, but also threw his arms in the air. Over the course of the next hour and a half, the newly formed team went about decorating their new dorm, while Blake set about sorting a rather ludicrous amount of books into varying categories. Yang moved about the room, putting up various posters, and Ruby was accidentally slicing apart the curtains. Naruto was much mellower in his personalization. On his desk, he put some new Ninchu ramen decorations and some of his personal reading on the shelves above, which included varied scrolls and books all in Ninshu to avoid any nosy picking. It seemed that was all he was going to do until he pulled out a scroll from Kami knows where and unsealed an entire new desk. This time it came with a small bonsai tree pot complete with a little waterfall. Oh, the wonders of seals! And the table was covered with so much paper, ink, brushes, and books that none of the good quality Hinokuni oak showed through the clutter that it held. What was that? He heard behind him. Turning, he saw that the room's three other occupants were staring in shock at the new desk present. Naruto's eye smiled and twirled the now empty scroll in his fingers. "Sealing scroll, really handy at carrying things," he explained. There was a zip, and Ruby appeared in front of Naruto with a flurry of rose petals and stared at the scroll with stars in her eyes. "So cool," she whispered. She looked at Naruto. "How does it work?" Naruto raised a curious eyebrow at Ruby, surprised that she wanted to know. "It's one of the most complicated shinobi disciplines because of its complexity and danger," he began explaining. "Danger?" Blake decided to join in. Naruto nodded. "One small mistake and the whole seal could collapse and explode," he said way too calmly. Both Blake and Ruby recoiled and looked at the scroll in wariness. He opened the scroll and showed it to Ruby and Blake when she walked over. "Each seal is made up of three symbols called kanji. Each symbol has its own meaning and purpose. It's also how we write." He ran his fingers along the seal, pointing out the specific parts. "Using the kanji in a specific pattern, we can tell it to do or make something." He highlighted a specific line. "For example, this line creates a pocket that the object goes into, and this one freezes it in time," he continued. Ruby scratched her face in thought. "I still don't get it." Naruto chuckled, ruffled her hair. "Don't worry if you don't. It's incredibly difficult to learn and understand. Even harder still to master it. But if you want a comparison, compare it to something like computer programming. From what I've heard, it's similar to Fuinjutsu. Each line has its purpose, and altogether it creates a working program. The same happens here," he finished. There was a cough behind them, drawing their attention away from the seal. As interesting as that was, we still haven't finished with our room," Yang pointed out irritably. The four collectively turned to look at the pile of beds in the center of the room. "Well, that's not going to work," Naruto stated. "It is a bit cramped," agreed Blake. "Maybe we should ditch some of our stuff, like the whole new desk that someone thought was a good idea." Yang glared at Naruto. "Or we could ditch the beds and replace them with bunk beds," Ruby cheered, as if the whole concept was her idea. "That is an interesting idea," Naruto wondered. "And super awesome," Yang joined in. "It would be efficient," Blake pointed out. "Great." Ruby grinned, and the four set about their new task. It was a quick job, and it showed in the results. Objective complete. Yang's bed was now propped up by some of Blake's spare books, but the thing that Naruto was most concerned about was the fact that Ruby's was dangling above his by just a piece of rope on each leg. Objective complete, perhaps, but I'd rather not Ruby falling on my head during the night." Naruto couldn't help but comment. "Well, do you have another solution?" Yang snarked. Naruto scoffed. "Actually, I do." He walked over to his new desk and rummaged around for a moment. He held up a small ink pot and shook it near his ear before putting it down and doing the same to another. Apparently this had more in as he held onto it and walked over to the bed. Lying down on his bed, he dipped the senbon he got from Kami knows where into the pot and began scratching a seal onto the bottom of Ruby's bed. He finished after a few minutes and paused to check his work. Nodding more to himself than the others, he got back off the bed and replaced his ink pot and senbon. He returned and placed his palm under the bed again, presumably on top of the seal. There was a flash of something, and the bed, without warning, righted itself against the wall. He turned to look at the three. "Observe." A kunai span into his hand, and he swiftly cut all the ropes connecting the bed to the ceiling. "What is it? What is it you say? Ta-da!" He grinned underneath his mask. This time it was Yang's turn to scoff. However, it was in annoyance this time. "So cool," Ruby again whispered when a thought came to her. "It's not going to suddenly explode, is it?" she asked worriedly. Naruto chuckled slightly. "Don't worry. I'm a certified seal master. The chance of one of my seals exploding are highly unlikely unless they are specifically made to do so," he reassured, and Ruby breathed a sigh of relief. "Could you do that for for Yang's?" Blake asked timidly, looking longingly at her books being used to hold the bed up. "No!" Yang exploded before Naruto even got a chance to answer. Blake looked at Yang shocked. "Why not? I will not have the shinobi going anywhere near my stuff," she growled threateningly. Naruto raised his hand in mock surrender. All right, easy," he vacated. He turned to Ruby. "What's next?" Ruby shrugged and sat on her bed, opening her school planner. She began to read off the day's events. "Well, today we've got a few classes together. First we have at 9. Wait, did you say 9?" Naruto interrupted, pointing at the alarm clock, which read 8:55. To class!" Ruby panicked and shot out of the room with Yang not far behind. Blake went to follow, but stopped when Naruto held out a hand to her. "What is it? Do you want me to add the seal now that she's not here?" Blake thought about it for a moment before shaking her head. "No, wait for her to warm up to you first. It won't be worth her getting angry about it. Besides, I've got plenty of books." Naruto nodded and looked down at the tie still around his neck. "Also, how do you do this?" he asked. Blake blinked. "Monster, demons, prowlers of the night," the first professor, Port, spoke to the class. "The creatures of Grimm have many names, but I merely refer to them as prey." He boasted. The class was silent. He coughed into his hands. "And you shall too upon graduating from this prestigious school." He began to walk around the class. "Now, as I was saying," Naruto tuned out the professor as he began a most likely heavily embellished autobiography about his younger days. He'd known that he should be listening to this, but despite being an elite shinobi, now he couldn't help but slip back into his previous tardy self, back when he was under Iruka's tenure. So as a way to at least look like he was doing something, he set about copying the notes on the wall behind the professor. At least they will provide useful information. That wasn't why Port's grandfather smelled like cabbages. He zoned back in when he heard Whis practically shoot from her chair with her hand raised. "I do, sir," she said with conviction, glaring at both Ruby and himself. He wasn't sure why, nor did he care. "Good. Then come and face your opponent," Port instructed, gesturing to a cage with glowing red eyes. It didn't take long for Whis to leave and return with her weapons. When she did so, she stood facing the now rattling cage with her rapier drawn. Her team and his shouted encouragements, although she had told Ruby to shut up. "All right," Port boomed, "let the match begin." He swung the axe, part of whatever he was holding, destroying the lock that held. The Borba tusk that was previously held inside charged out towards the first thing in its sight, which just happened to be Whis. She rolled to the side and struck the Grim across its mask as it went past, not even scratching it. "Ha! Weren't expecting that, were you?" Port said from the side, and Whis glanced at him over her shoulder. "You can do this, Whis!" Ruby yelled, but Whis threw her a glare as well. Naruto stayed silent throughout the battle, quietly observing how the Shinin fought. She seemed to struggle momentarily against the beast, getting her rapier caught between the tusks before freeing it, and then using her glyphs to flip the Grim on its back and launching herself at it, stabbing it with her sword. They both slid to the stop not far from and we stood, extracting her sword from the now decomposing rim. Bravo, bravo! We seem to be in the presence of a true huntress. Port praised. I'm afraid that's all the time we have for today. Be sure to do the signed reading and stay vigilant, he reminded. Class dismissed. As the class stood up, we shot Ruby one final glare before walking off, making the two teams give each other concerned looks, with Ruby deciding to go after her. Naruto casually strode through the halls alone, having waited until the class was empty before leaving. He thought about the fight and how the Shnee had performed. While it wasn't the first time he had heard of such glyphs, it was the first time he had gotten a close look at them. They seemed to be a more linear version of Uzumaki seals, but there were of course similarities. He couldn't get a more in-depth understanding of them unless he specifically asked the Shnee, something he was sure as the demon sealed inside of him he wouldn't be doing anytime soon, or even if he could help it. Is it true? Did you make a mistake? He heard a soft voice ask. He sped up slightly and rounded the corner to witness Ruby talking to Ospen. Wanted to find out what happened, he swiftly disappeared into one of the column's shadows with practiced ease. Ruby, I have made more mistakes than any man, woman, or child on this planet, but right now, I don't think that making you team leader is one of them. Do you? Osplin began. Being a team leader isn't about just carrying the title into battle, but a badge you wear constantly. If you don't perform at your absolute best, then and what reason do you give for others to follow you? Ruby looked down and thought. Ospen turned away. You have been given a daunting responsibility, Ruby. I advise you to take some time to think about how you will uphold it. He finished walking away. He gave a glance at the shadows where Naruto was hiding. Don't you think, Kitsune? He asked without stopping. Ruby's head shot up at hearing his alias and watched as he stepped out of the shadows. He walked up to her and placed a hand on her back, gently pushing her down the hall that would lead to their dorm. They walked in silence for a while, neither having much to say. Naruto eventually sighed deeply. I don't even envy you, Ruby, he said simply. Ruby sent him a curious look. What do you mean? Being team leader is a big responsibility, one I know all too well. Ruby stopped, causing Naruto to do so as well. Wait, you've been a team leader? Naruto sighed again. Yes, many times. Being a team leader isn't all it's cracked up to be. You have to make decisions and sacrifices that no other is willing to make, and then live with the consequences once you have. He looked strangely melancholy for a moment. Not only that, but you have to inspire spirit into your fellow teammates and be a beacon of hope in the darkness that surrounds you. Something I very much doubt Whis is particularly good at. He bent over slightly to be eye level with the smaller girl. You, on the other hand, are, as I can see, are doing just that and more. Being a leader isn't easy, not by a long stretch, but it is far too early to see if you would be any good at leading a squad into battle right now. But for the future, well, we'll just have to see, won't we? He finished with a nice smile, one that Ruby tried to replicate. He put a hand on Ruby's head and tousled her hair slightly. Now, come on, we have a free period, may as well use it, he said, standing straight again. Aspen watched from the shadows, much like Naruto had earlier with a smile on his face. This will be an interesting year, he thought. End of chapter 4.